Thank you, and thank you, Commissioner Rohit, for joining us for what I hope to be a discussion, an actual discussion. And frankly, as the Chief Climate Officer of New York, let me just sort of put it very bluntly. The average New Yorker emits half the CO2 emissions, a third possibly even, of sort of the average household living in the suburbs, right? So isn't your job primarily to
declare victory and
get
go
out
home?
of the way,
Oh, okay.
declare victory, and well, basically make New York City even more attractive, right? Build more housing, basically do the sort of things that maybe the local environmentalists wouldn't want you to do, right? The local chapter of the National Environmental Group that doesn't want to build housing because it increases, emissions here. But from the big picture, we want more people to move here, right? We want to have more people live like New Yorkers, presumably in New York.
Well, first of all, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm super excited. As you see, I am an alum of Columbia Business School. This is the first time I've been on the new campus, so I'm really excited that there's elbow room compared to what I remember from Uris Hall back in the day, and ceilings that presumably will not come down on us. So really exciting to be here, and I'm thrilled and honored to be invited to this conference, which has such a long and important history and such a significant role here at Columbia, which I think among all business schools has a great tradition of thinking about the social impact and opportunity for social impact of enterprise. So really excited to be here. And yeah, I mean, to your question, there is no question that actually it's very easy for us as a city, and I think some of the environmental activists fall into this trap of losing sight of what the biggest opportunity for New York City to contribute to the climate fight is, which is actually to grow as a city. There is no question. And that does require us to think carefully about how we ensure that we are doing the things that we can and must do in terms of decarbonization and becoming more energy efficient and reducing our use of natural gas and ultimately ending our use of natural gas and things like that. But taking into account the fact that if we take what is already a prohibitively expensive place to live and make it more prohibitively expensive, we may actually have canceled out all of the positive impact we could do, right? And so that is a very real tension for us, and it's something that does require us to think about the trade-offs. It is, I think, a microcosm of the broader challenge that I'd argue the environmental world still has not fully come to terms with, the reality of how the climate imperative is different from where the environmental movement really started, call it 50 years ago, right, in its current form. And the way I think about that is that, in, 1970, stop was probably the best environmental strategy, right? Because what were we building in 1970? We were building greenfield tract houses, we were building highways, we were building coal-fired power plants or nuclear power plants. Right? Basically anything we were doing was bad for the environment. And so stopping it all was the right answer. And now we're in a very different place where we have to accelerate all the things that we now know we need. And my biggest concern actually is not that we don't have the right policies in place. My biggest concern is that the institutions we have can't deliver on those policies as quickly as we need them to, right? Which ultimately runs the risk not only of failing to outrun climate change, but frankly, of kind of, calling into question whether democracy works and like really profound things.
Can you give us some examples? So maybe, so there's the federal level Inflation Reduction Act, lots of money. I, as the individual homeowner wanting to take advantage of a certain tax credit for my energy efficiency, I can't because the rule hasn't been written yet. Yeah. Now, that's not New York City's problem in this case, right? That's DOE, Department of Energy, and New York State. But what are sort of New York examples?
Well, our government moves slowly, right? And it's one example that's been very top of mind for me lately is around resilience, stormwater resilience, right? We know, and Hurricane Ida 2 years ago made clear to us that New York City's risk in terms of climate change is not just of coastal inundation, like we had during Hurricane Sandy, but also from rainfall, and we had 13 New Yorkers lost their lives during Hurricane Ida. And then only a month or so ago, we had another big storm with Hurricane Ophelia, or the remnants of Hurricane Ophelia, that gave the city a rainfall that was second only to Hurricane Ida in intensity, right? And the numbers are dramatic, right? That New York City, until 2021, had literally never experienced a rainfall of 1.75 inches per hour. And by the way, flooding is not about how much rain falls. Flooding is about how much rain falls in what amount of time, right? It's a rate question. It's not a volume question. And so our sewers are designed, in theory, and of course, they're never always at full capacity, but the target for design was 1.75 inches, which we had no record of, right? So that was a pretty conservative target. And then in August of 2021, Hurricane Henri gave us 1.9 inches per hour. And then Hurricane Ida gave us 3.75 inches per hour. And Hurricane Ophelia gave us 3.58 inches per hour in North Brooklyn, which is where the worst flooding was, right? And our climate has now changed. In 2020, as you probably know, the National Climate Assessment recategorized New York City from the continental climate zone to the subtropical climate zone. And almost eerily, that's when we started to see a change in some of the rainfall. And we had a little bit less of it this summer. 2022 was particularly stark in this respect, where we had a whole series of cloudbursts that are much more like the kind of rainfall that at least I personally would associate with Florida or the Caribbean or Southeast Asia, where you might have rain come out of nowhere. It's incredibly intense, it's short duration, and it could be pouring rain here, and 2 blocks away, there's nothing going on, right? We had one rainstorm last September that we first got the warning that there was going to be an intense rainstorm at 5 a.m. The storm started at 6, it was over at 7:15. Central Park got 0.15 inches of rain. LaGuardia Airport got 2.25 inches of rain, right? Think about that variability. And northern Queens had terrible flooding that morning, for obvious reasons, right? And so in any case, the challenge, and getting back to the question of time, is, well, okay, we now know we have got to rethink the sewer system. We've got to augment it with green infrastructure. We're not going to be able to do this with traditional underground concrete pipes. But the time frame to rebuild an infrastructure that has taken basically since 1835 to bring to its current state, right, is not something that's measured in years, right? This is a multi-decade-long transition, and yet people are already saying, and rightfully so, hey, it's been 2 years. What the heck? Like, haven't you fixed this? And I've got like at DEP, I've got a ton of engineers working on this. But even one sewer upgrade is at least 5 years from starting work on design to having it in the ground. At least 5 years. Right? And then you think about how many of those we have to do at once. We've never had that much. I mean, one of the things that I often talk about, and in fact spent much of my first year in this current job, I rejoined city government at the beginning of last year, and I spent all of 2022 talking about the fact that as chief climate officer, I had 2 top priorities. One was figuring out how to implement Local Law 97, which is our building decarbonization law. The other was reforming DEP's procurement processes. Because at the time, DEP only had the ability to contract about $1.5 billion worth of capital projects a year. And if we could not get to $3 or $4 billion a year, there is no way that we could move towards resilience, right? But that's not about climate policy. That's about the nuts and bolts of how you deliver an operation, right? And that's, whether it is that, whether it is, another conundrum that we're looking at is around voluntary buyouts, right? We, back in April, in the latest version of the city's sustainability plan, Plan YC, Mayor Adams made the commitment that we were going to stand up a voluntary buyout program, which is absolutely critical. We're going to have to do it. The first step is not actually to figure out where we ought to buy people out. The first step is to figure out what's the institutional mechanism. And among the things we have to address is the fact that when the city wants to acquire property, it has to go through ULURP, the Uniform Land Review Process, Land Use Review Process, which is 11 months long. So you think about a buyout program where you want to be able to have a standing offer so that the day a storm hits, somebody is incentivized to take your buyout offer as opposed to start the reconstruction process. And that morning, after the storm clears, we're going to say, great, hold tight, we're going to start ULURP now, right? It doesn't really work. And so that's a question that we've got to figure out is, how do we do that? Do we have to change the law? That would require going to Albany. Is there some comprehensive ULURP we could do? We're trying to work all that through. But that's yet another example of the kind of hurdles. And of course, that kind of approval is there for a reason. It's so that the local community understands what the city is doing when it is acquiring property. So it's a democratic, it's a pro-democratic restriction. But it is also going to hinder us, at least in one strategy that we might embrace.
You mentioned Local Law 97, which is, you will know the taglines better, right? But one of the most ambitious building decarbonization laws anywhere in the city. 40%, minus 40% by 2030, which, by the way, right, is tomorrow in sort of building terms. Right. We now know some of the more details about the rules and implementation. Once again, right, it's all about implementation. How does that intersect with sort of resiliency and broader considerations, right? For example, let's make sure New York City doesn't become less affordable while we encourage the right kind of investments.
Well, look, Local Law 97, as you point out, and I would imagine many of you know, was enacted in 2019. So pre-pandemic, frankly, a very different economic environment, as we all know. And then kind of the world went into hiatus for a couple of years. Which is why the rules for Local Law 97 were not done when the Adams administration took office at the beginning of 2022. And so getting those rules underway was, in fact, as I said, one of my top priorities and one of the mayor's top priorities. The first requirements for that, and again, I would imagine many of you know, but it covers large buildings in the city. It basically gives a carbon budget based on the use type and size of buildings, and it ratchets down so that the first requirements kick in this January 1st, so in 10 weeks or whatever it is, and then in 2030, and then in 2035, and onward down to carbon neutrality in 2050. And all large buildings are covered, and that's one of the key things that I think a lot of people have this assumption, oh, well, this is about fancy office buildings owned by billionaires. But in fact, roughly half of the buildings that will have to do work to comply with Local Law 97 are residential, and a large portion of those are low and moderate income co-ops and condos.
So it's any building over 25,000 square feet.
Correct, correct. It doesn't matter, there's not exemptions other than for affordable rentals. So rent-regulated rentals have a separate compliance path, which I think the council members who wrote the law thought was going to be easier to comply with. We've now actually had a lot of the building owners of affordable housing come to us and say, well, we'd rather take the 2030 path, but we're not sure we're allowed to. And that's actually something we're trying to change through rulemaking if we can. But the other reality is that when the law was passed, there wasn't a lot of focus on what it was going to require. And so we've now done the modeling. We believe that complying with Local Law 97, there are 15,000 buildings that have to do work for 2030. As you point out, that's basically tomorrow. It's going to require between $12 and $15 billion in investments. So it's roughly $1 million per building on average to come into compliance. Now, averages are misleading. And one of the challenges is there are going to be a whole bunch of buildings where it's going to be fairly cheap, fairly easy, and it's going to pay for itself no problem, right? If you're a building and you have to do 10 or 15% reductions, it's going to pay for itself. You could get a market rate loan or whatever and not a problem. You also, at the other end, have a bunch of buildings where it is going to be breathtakingly expensive. And in fact, we believe there is a segment of buildings across the city where the fines, which are in fact pretty sizable, it's $268 per ton, so it is basically a carbon fine. It will be cheaper for the building to pay the fines basically forever than to come into compliance with the law, because we are all accustomed to believing that, well, energy reduction is going to save you money. And that's true if you're changing light bulbs or taking those 10 or 15%. But when you have to go to 80% or 60% reductions and you're talking about switching from natural gas to electric, your costs actually go up, right? And that's the unfortunate reality of the way we are currently dealing with fossil fuels, and we haven't taxed fossil fuels enough to make that a cost-effective trade-off, right? And so that is going to come with buildings that do this. Now, what we have proposed, and we just actually had the hearing earlier this week, so the Department of Buildings will be sorting through the comments that we received, is a process that would actually take buildings that are out of compliance in 2024, force them either to pay the fine or to enter into a settlement agreement that'll get to their 2030 targets. And the theory behind that is one of management, because, again, the law was basically written on the idea that, well, we're going to give people a target and we're going to tell them what the penalty is, and they're going to go figure it out. Now, if you've ever managed anything, like, you know that telling people what the target is and what the price of failure is and hoping for the best is not a good management strategy, right? I hope that's not what they are teaching you here, right?
Sticks alone don't.
Exactly. If you're going, well, it's not just about carrots and sticks, it's also about being able to keep track of what people are doing, right? If you're managing a team, you have checkpoints before the deliverable, right? You don't just wait and hope that the deliverable is what you would want. And so part of what we want to do is pull these buildings in so that they have to enter into a settlement agreement that gives us the ability to monitor what they are doing every year towards their 2030 targets, which they have to deliver in theory. But if they're out of compliance in 2024, they're probably the ones that are going to be most likely to be out of compliance in 2030. And what the planet cares about is not the fines. What the planet cares about is whether this work gets done. And that's what we're trying to focus on. The other thing that we're really trying to do, and I got to say, like, it's very frustrating. I've found a very big difference in the way politics works versus I was in the Bloomberg administration, and I'm now of an age where I can say things like, it was so much better in the old days. But I think politics are somewhat different, and they are quite shallow. And it has become very easy to focus on, well, the fines and the rules while missing the fact, and this is actually something that I think this community here should fully understand. What's important is not the fines. What's important is actually the mobilization of all of this work. And so what we really are trying to spend our effort on is getting the technical assistance out there, figuring out where the financing and funding and subsidies are going to come from. People did not appreciate, there was a lot of attention on the hearing the other day, people did not appreciate, we had a big milestone where the governor signed legislation to reinstate a tax break for residential housing that's below certain values, right, which will cover most of the low and middle income co-ops and condos that have to comply with Local Law 97. And if that gets implemented, that's what will allow buildings to pay for their upgrades that they need. Right? And so a lot of the concern that we've got, there's a whole effort in certain parts of New York City to repeal Local Law 97 And it stems a lot from these buildings that we are now beginning to have an answer for them of how they can pay for it. We still need to find them financing because that is a tax abatement that pays out over 10 or 15 years. And if you've got a co-op that doesn't have a professional manager, doesn't have a lot of reserves, it will still need to take out a loan, even if that loan will be paid over time by the tax break that they're going to get.
I mean, so full disclosure, co-op board president, small building in Lower Manhattan. So we are too small to be covered by Local Law 97.
Okay.
And in some sense, okay, too rich to have to worry about the financing in the sense of, right, if the heat pump makes more sense, since the heat pump makes sense, because we wouldn't pass the gas inspection, so instead of investing in the gas upgrade, in a building built in 1836, I believe, is sort of the ±5. So yeah, but, right, the challenge is, how do you get the upfront capital? And so let me just show you this. So rumor has it, right, you actually wrote some of this, is that
Yeah.
right? So, right, getting 97 done. Which, yeah, right, so, I mean, actually, okay, here's the, we are not covered by this. Yeah, there's some stuff in there that's basically, oh, wow, let me walk to our bank and say, wait, if it makes sense for larger buildings, right? Yes, it makes sense for us to cut the gas line as a building if we manage to, right, convince the 6 other neighbors. One is a holdout, I can tell you, right? 5 have signed on, 5 have the heat pump. So how do you convince the, right, even somebody who can afford it? But this is basically where, well, look, you can pay the $300 fine in a couple years, starting in a couple years, or we can come up with a plan for you to take that money and invest it.
That's right.
Right? Now, here's the uncomfortable bit, right? In the wider climate world, we have something called offsets, where you basically, right, you don't do the hard stuff, you buy the cheap offset instead. In New York City, it's not offsets in that sense, right, planting trees somewhere, but it's REC credits, renewable energy credits, which are permissible for compliance. So suddenly, I don't think anyone knows the number for the RECs in a few years that qualify, but instead of $300, the fine just became $30-ish, order of magnitude less. So my incentive just became a lot less.
Well, so yeah, there's been a lot of attention paid to this question of renewable energy credits in Local Law 97. And I think one of the, so you correctly pointed out, this isn't an offset, right? The RECs that qualify for Local Law 97 are in fact very tightly defined, so much so that there are none available right now.
They're not available today, right? But
And there are unlikely to be any available at least until 2027.
Okay.
Right, when the Champlain Hudson Power Express comes into service. It is also a real question what the price is going to be. We actually do not think it'll be anywhere near $30. We think it'll be well above that.
Higher, okay.
Much higher. And in fact, our modeling suggests that by 2030, the price of those RECs may well exceed the $268 fine.
Yeah.
So, our position, first of all, the law explicitly says RECs are allowable. What we have said is that if you choose this compliance path where you will be protected from fines for 2 years as long as you enter into this 2030 compliance path, you may not use RECs. Because you don't need extra time if you're just going to do a financial
Just investing the money
solution,
anyways.
right? If you choose not to, you kind of have an as-of-right approach that says, well, pay the fine or find a financial solution later on.
Yep.
We just don't think a lot of buildings are going to do that. So frankly, I think the RECs issue is a bit of a red herring. We will see. The other thing that's important to note about RECs is that we've got to get the electricity sector decarbonized. And I think there's a sense that, well, we've got to do everything everywhere. And the reality is we may want to figure out how we sequence. And for a building where the cost to comply with Local Law 97 would be very high, having that contribution to the energy transition may actually be a very positive thing for the planet. And I think many of you, if you're paying attention in New York, you know that over the last 2 weeks, the energy transition in New York took a couple of steps backwards, right? And we are expecting a number of the offshore wind projects to pull out of the contracts that they've had. It will be, we don't know what will happen with the second upstate transmission line, Clean Path, which is another one. And again, if those don't go forward, then there are no RECs at all, right? So it's a moot point.
Fair enough, but right, incentives do work, turns out, right? So if there's sort of infinite, but large demand from New York City, you could imagine somebody waking up and saying, wait, it might pay to develop something that could qualify.
Well, and if they do, though, it's not the end of the world.
I think that's a good thing,
because
right?
what qualifies, I mean, again, because this isn't about planting trees on the other side of the world. What qualifies, and I think this is a thoughtful aspect of this law, is it's very tightly defined. It has to be new capacity that's renewable and that plugs directly into New York City. So you're not just buying white tags from California or something either. It would directly increase the supply of renewable power to New York, and therefore help to decarbonize the entire city. But look, the other thing is, right now it's kind of theoretical, right? And so part of what we've got to do is roll up our sleeves and get to work, as opposed to fight about the theory of this.
Fair enough. Now, okay, what isn't theoretical, right? So 70% of New York City's emissions, buildings, 30% traffic.
Mm-hmm. Roughly.
Roughly, right? You know, plus minus 5, 10. And we don't just have local law 97 kicking in next year, we have congestion pricing. Now, okay, that's pricing of congestion, not of the carbon pollution associated with, but of course, less traffic, presumably fewer internal combustion engines, less CO2, less local air pollution too, which all of that is good.
And not to mention a lot more money to invest in the transit system.
And $1 billion for MTA, yes. So I realize that's not under your immediate purview necessarily. I don't think you wrote the guide to how to implement congestion pricing, or maybe
I did 15 years ago, but
that's, okay, fair enough, yes. Actually, that's right, yeah, so it's been like, we've known about, 17 years by now or so, right?
It depends on how you, of course, I'm blanking on his name, but of course it was a Columbia professor who came up with the concept.
Yes.
And then it was endorsed by the Regional Plan Association in 1996, endorsed by Mayor Bloomberg in Plan YC that I was involved in 2007. And so, yeah, we've been working on congestion pricing for 17 years.
Forever, okay.
So, see my earlier point about how sometimes democracy takes a long time.
Well, frankly, if you ask, sort of Charlie Komanoff, sort of bike active, right, from, talked about it in the 70s, essentially, right, that there might be a reason to price the negative externality here. And now we are basically, well, we don't know the fee yet, right? We don't know whether it's $15, 23, or whatever the maximum fee per vehicle entering Lower Manhattan, below 60th Street, might be. But we know it's coming, right? How do you think about it, right? So on the one hand, great, right? On the other, back to essentially New York City is doing lots of things right already. We are now making driving into New York less affordable. Now, okay, as the non-driving Manhattanite living in that congestion zone, fantastic, bring it on. On the other hand, of course, right, there's some political pushback.
Well, yeah, and look, and I think there is a real question that, first of all, as I've said, I've been a proponent of congestion pricing. I did my city council hearings and state assembly hearings on it back in 2007, and I'm very glad I don't have to go to the congestion mitigation task force now. One of the things that I think is so powerful about the concept of congestion pricing for Manhattan is that it should not really be a significant imposition, right? It is one thing, it is much more problematic to say to somebody, no matter where you live, you've got to spend money to upgrade your building, right? To say, hey, instead of driving into Midtown, you're going to have to take the train, or you're going to pay, which is not the end of the world, just you're paying. That's a very big difference. I think what makes New York City so, so perfect for congestion pricing is the fact that there is access to transit to Midtown Manhattan from basically everywhere in the region.
Yep.
And and again, you have to think about the frequency of events when somebody really, quote unquote, needs to drive, right? Sure, you're buying furniture or whatever. Every now and then there is something where a vehicle is actually really important.
Sure.
But those are going to be infrequent in the grand scheme of things, right? So I don't see congestion pricing as being the real challenge. And in the world of, among certainly going back to when I was fighting that fight directly back during the Bloomberg years, a lot of the concern was on the part of companies that made deliveries. And the reality is, and in London they saw this, the delivery companies got so much more efficient because the traffic improved that totally offset whatever they paid for their own vehicles, right? And so it was actually the privilege of having faster deliveries that was, in fact, an economic benefit.
Turns out pricing congestion is in
Turns
fact,
out pricing works.
Turns
out pricing works.
Okay, we have 25 minutes and lots of hands. Good. So why don't we start right here?
Hi, Rohit. It's a pleasure to have you here. For the last 4 months, I've pretty much breathed benchmarking, so it really is a great time. My concern is that about 30% of the city's buildings are above 25,000 square feet, and we've got a plan for those. But those less than that aren't being pushed forward by benchmarking. I see in the long term there being a disparity with small, poor-performing buildings and the large buildings being pushed to be more efficient. Does the city have a plan for that at all?
Well, I'm not going to tell you that we have a plan that is going to do everything for those buildings, but you're totally right. There's a long tail, right? So we have, in New York City, we have 1 million structures, roughly speaking. Of those, about 50 or 60,000 are large buildings that comprise about half of the square footage and about half of the overall energy consumption. In that long tail of small buildings, the vast majority are actually 1 to 4 family homes. And while some of them are pretty fancy, high value 1 to 4 family homes, it might be a brownstone or more likely to be a larger home in like College Point in Queens or Riverdale in the Bronx, the vast majority of those 1 to 4 family homes are actually low to middle income. And so one of the things we've been very much trying to figure out is what it would take to create the package that would help those homes decarbonize. One thing that we announced back in April that is a partnership between the Adams administration and Controller Brad Lander is something called Public Solar NYC. And we actually, I'm very pleased in one of these things that's like totally unsung and will never get any press, but took a lot of work and is a very big deal. New York City and New York State actually submitted a joint proposal to the Department of Energy for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is part of the Inflation Reduction Act, as you probably know, to fund, and one of the components of that application is to fund public solar as a $60 million loan fund that would be directed at 1 to 4 family homes in low-income parts of the city to decarbonize and do that kind of whole building decarbonization effort. The challenge with that sector of structures in New York City is that as many problems as the large buildings have, there's just so little professional management, right? I mean, you're talking about people who might have a 2-family house, maybe they rent out, one part of it. They don't have the technical expertise to fill out benchmarking data. They're like imposing requirements on them when many of them are already struggling to do the basics of managing real estate is a real challenge. And I think, that's another place where over time, once we can get the large buildings to lead, get something where solar and overall whole house electrification has an economic engine behind it, I think that becomes much more of a carrot that you use incentives for a while and then you come much later with mandates, because the ability to comply with mandates, the politics behind those are just really problematic. And it goes back to Gernot's point that, like, you're talking about, these are the same places where they have illegal basement apartments, right? That house 50,000 New Yorkers in illegal basement apartments. And yeah, we could shut them all down tomorrow with a lot of enforcement, but we've already got a housing crisis, right? Do we want to take 50,000 units that are housing the lowest income New Yorkers out of service? And so we have to be really thoughtful about how hard we push that sector.
And it is sort of a sequencing question, right? So now you're training 100,000 electricians for the large buildings. Well, that's the next thing to tackle, right?
Right. That's right.
Hey, right here. Chris Canzoni, second-year MBA. Thanks for being here today. Great conversation. Also, thank you for your service to the city. Quick question I have within specific to the adaptation portion of your portfolio. Is the city considering sea level or sea walls in the future? And if that is so, what are the risks associated with that very long-term project, but also the financing considerations for the city?
That is a good question. And yes, I talked a lot about stormwater, of course, since Hurricane Sandy. And in fact, before we started talking about sea level rise as an issue in 2006. Hurricane Sandy comes along and makes it very real for a lot of New Yorkers that coastal inundation is the most catastrophic risk we face. It may not be the most frequent or likely in terms of number of events. There's been a lot of work going on. So first of all, there's been several $1 billion in post-Sandy work, including most notably the East Side Coastal Resilience Project, which is a seawall protecting part of the Lower East Side. Just last year, we started construction on what's basically the southern extension of that between the Manhattan Bridge and the Brooklyn Bridge. There's a plan that's relatively far along in engineering design, although the financing, as you mentioned, is still a question, for the stretch that connects Battery Park to that area, so what we call FIDI Seaport, the financial district, and South Street Seaport. Battery Park City is underway, actually, with a plan. It's the Battery Park City Authority is going to be doing their own coastal protection work. And then there's a question about what happens on the southern part of the Hudson shoreline of Manhattan. But of course, New York City is far from just Manhattan. There's work that's going on. It's much earlier stage than I would like in Red Hook. And there's a real question there because one of the issues that is being wrestled with in Red Hook is, what do you protect? Do you try to protect absolutely everything at the risk of destroying the view and destroying waterfront access? Or do you think about maybe going inland a little bit, accepting that some buildings might be unprotected, but having something that's much more consistent with neighborhood look and feel? Right, that's a trade-off that we're gonna have to wrestle with, I think, across the city. We've got a project that the Army Corps of Engineers is leading, again, one that's been many years delayed, building a seawall on the south shore of Staten Island. Staten Island suffered actually the largest group of deaths during Hurricane Sandy, and so that's a very important project. Stuff going on in the Rockaways. The Army Corps has completed work expanding the beach and building a berm, basically a seawall that looks like the beach, protecting the ocean side of Far Rockaway. The bay side is much more complex because that's Jamaica Bay. There's a different infrastructure there. And so that is actually at the very early stages. We're just starting environmental review. All of that is just the beginning because one thing the Army Corps of Engineers, which is nationally the entity that does coastal protection, is doing is a multi-year study called the Harbor and Tributary Study, HATS. And they last year issued a preferred alternative, which envisioned a harbor-wide set of defenses mostly along the shoreline. So basically envisioning a series of seawalls protecting almost the entire New York City coastline. We have more than 500 miles of shoreline in New York, with a handful of sea barriers at places like Jamaica Bay or Newtown Creek, where it would be impractical to protect on land. It's a challenge, right? And it's a challenge because if you design these things to be inexpensive, you can reduce the cost. If you do that, you are building a wall and you are undoing the 30 and 40-year effort that we've had to regain access to our waterfront, right? If you do the better designs, you actually have to do a lot more terraforming, for lack of a better word. You wind up with a much bigger footprint for what you're doing. That creates a lot more disruption in the community. One of the big fights around the final plan for the East Side Coastal Resilience Project was about cutting down 50 trees, right? Which
50, right?
50.
50,
Yeah, and it's terrible to think about cutting down 50 old-growth trees. On the other hand, there were other alternatives, which could have been just build a seawall. Instead, the idea was to raise the park so that there's still great waterfront access with a place that can, with a device, a big berm, that can be a park and provide great waterfront access while protecting the inland area. Coastal defense is going to be really difficult, and it's going to be breathtakingly expensive. Each of these projects is a multi-billion-dollar project. The total budget as projected today for the Army Corps' vision for how to protect all of New York City is $52 billion. $52 billion. There is no way that is not half of what we will ultimately spend on it, best case, right? And we don't have a financing mechanism for that, right? So right now, some of the thing that has concerned me is that over the last 10 years, we've done almost all of our work, even though the city has put in a lot of money, all of our work has been shaped by federal grants that were disaster recovery grants for Hurricane Sandy. Hurricane Sandy is not the last word, right? And so there are parts of the city that are completely vulnerable, but because of the way the tide and the wind and the inundation happened during Hurricane Sandy, they just didn't get damaged. They're not eligible for anything, and they've had no work done, right? And so among the things that we now need to do is step back and think about a comprehensive approach that's going to require us asking the question, where's the money going to come from, right? And then the final thing, as I was saying earlier, is we don't have an institution that does this. So among the things that I was surprised by when I came in is realizing that each of these projects has a different city agency that's trying to implement them, right? Which means you don't get the economies of scale. We were trying to run a capital project out of the mayor's office. That is not a good place to run capital projects that take decades. And so another thing that we decided to do that Mayor Adams announced back in April is that my agency, the Department of Environmental Protection, is going to take responsibility for coastal resilience. And so we are standing up a new bureau within my agency. We have a Bureau of Water Supply that runs the reservoirs, and a Bureau of Wastewater Treatment that runs all of our treatment plants, and a Bureau of Water or Sewer that manages all of the pipes underneath the streets. We're now going to have a Bureau of Coastal Resilience, and just last week, actually, we completed the search and appointed our first deputy commissioner for that role, which I'm really excited about. So we're in the process of figuring out exactly what functions, maintaining the seawalls at Esker, for example, doing the planning, interfacing with the Army Corps, exactly what functions will be within this new bureau. But the idea is to give it the same kind of permanent home that allows us to do multi-decade planning like we do for water tunnels, like we do for reservoirs, things like that. So there's a lot of work. I'm not going to tell you we're anywhere near done. You will all be retired before we even consider slowing down on our coastal resilience work, because we're going to be playing catch up with climate change for the rest of the lives of everybody in this room.
Now, of course, before everyone retires, right? So there's clearly a role for MBAs working with you directly.
Mm-hmm.
What role is there for the local startup, climate tech, social entrepreneur community to work with the city on some of this?
Well, I mean, there's a lot where we work with companies, but I'd say actually the biggest contributions are innovating around scale and speed and cost, right? I mean, it's what makes successful startups, right? And whether it is how do you employ design and financing to make it easier and faster for a building to do that retrofit? What do you do in terms of harnessing new technology in different packages like heat pumps, where you understand the weirdness of the market here in New York City and the bizarre subsegments of the markets in New York City, where you could have these really important niche players that could gain traction because they've designed something that fits within a space that is standard only in New York City buildings built between 1960 and 1980, but all of them have it, right? And that's the kind of thing we have. So I mean, I think there is something around that. There's also, I got to tell you, when I leave my current job, I want to start a resilience tech VC because there's a lot of money to be made in helping people protect themselves against climate change. It's sad. It's not kind of where you want to start because you want to start by solving the problem. But one of the realities is people are much readier to spend money to protect what they already have. I mean, as we all know from psychology, right? You know, people will
Loss aversion.
that's it, loss aversion. Thank you. And this is where loss aversion really plays a role. That people will spend a lot of money to harden their home against flooding or deal with heat spikes or whatever. And I think we need to help people do that. I have been shocked. In my role at DEP, I've spent a lot of time over the last 2 years doing walking tours with local electeds and others, visiting people who want to talk about, here's how the flooding affected me, here's what I lost during Ida, here's what happened on my block. And it is fascinating when I will bring people from my agency and we will go in the basement, we'll ask questions and say, well, that drain, why is that drain there? And they say, oh, because my plumber told me to put it there. And my guys will say, that's the worst possible place for a drain, no wonder you're flooding, right? Or people who will say, well, the water comes out of here, and we'll say, well, that's your internal piping. Where is that connected to?
Yep.
And they're like, oh, we don't know, right? And what's interesting to me, having spent much of my career focused on energy efficiency and decarbonization, is I mean, it actually goes back to the oil crisis of the 1970s, but we've developed an entire set of mechanisms for how to help people get technical advice on how to understand and implement energy efficiency in their homes. We are going to have to do the same thing. And another thing that we found that we invested a lot of time and effort in during the Bloomberg administration was realizing that with all the best intentions, most of the building engineers and most of the architects in New York City did not understand the energy code. They thought they did, but they actually didn't. And so we had to train the building professionals into all of these new techniques. I think we're going to have to train plumbers, right? Because, what's your average New York City plumber? Their main expertise is like bathroom fixtures and connecting all the pipes inside the house. And then you say, oh, hey, help me deal with the flooding in front of my house. They're making it up as they go along, I fear, right? And we're going to have to help them get really expert in that kind of demand. There's an opportunity.
Climate resiliency VC. Go ahead.
Thank you. And hi again, Rit. Nice to see you. My organization, the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, our mission is solely foreclosure prevention, protecting low to middle income communities, 1 to 4 home families. And so, as you probably know, and you mentioned the basement apartment rentals. By the way, we did try to start a program with the city to repair basements. I didn't get off the ground. But we are working with the city on Flood Help New York and some other work. And we've done a lot of the community development block disaster recovery work. About the building acquisition program, so those homes that are most vulnerable to flooding are in communities that are most vulnerable to economically and to any disaster. And they're also some of our richest ethnic communities. And so I think it goes back to sort of how your agency would work with the housing organizations and going back to wanting to keep New York City a place where LMI people can grow and thrive because we need that to make this city work. So, is it just to accomplish buying the homes and getting them out of those areas, but how would there also be work to protect or not disrupt the community stabilization?
Well, okay, and the components that you're identifying are among the institutional tasks that we're trying to figure out, right? Which is why a buyout program is not just draw lines on a map and get a stash of money to go make offers, right? We are certainly thinking about how do you help people make informed decisions about what they should do? Should they accept a buyout offer? Should they wait, frankly, until a storm? Whatever. Those are questions. In some cases, you might be talking about very targeted locations where it's only a couple of homes. That's one thing. There may be other circumstances where we realize there's actually a whole section of a community that would need to get bought out. And that's a very different conversation around is there a way to help think about how that community could stay together if it is relocated? Happily, we've got smart people who work in housing and understand this who are embarking on thinking those things through. Excuse me, but it's certainly something we're trying to take into account.
Okay, 2 more questions. Go.
Hi, thank you so much for coming in and talking to us. I'm glad you brought up Local Law 97 because there are other cities and states across the nation who have followed suit and sort of established their own building ordinance for, building energy performances and all of that. So what do you think has propelled that? And do you think there's enough momentum for building, I guess, performance metrics?
Well, look, I think, first of all, as the song says, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. And I do think that, for nearly 20 years, New York has, on several aspects of climate policy, set a standard that other cities follow. So, New York and Seattle, in fact, we partnered back during the Bloomberg years to propose mandatory benchmarking. We did it the same day as a partnership with Mayor Nichols and Mayor Bloomberg that day, and since then, benchmarking has become a very common mandate. I think the beginnings of a proliferation of building performance standards reflects the fact that benchmarking didn't do enough, right? It laid the groundwork. It gave us an amount of data without which we couldn't set building performance standards. But we're going to need to get much more aggressive and much more directive about how buildings move towards decarbonization. So I think one way or another, it's gotta be done, and that's why we're so committed to implementing Local Law 97. I don't know if that fully answers your question. Is that okay? Good, thank you.
You didn't plug C40.
I didn't plug C40. I love C40. The C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. Everybody loves it.
Which is, by the way, not 40 cities anymore, but
Not
it's
40.
like
Now it's up to
hundreds.
100, and I think they've decided enough is enough. But
Okay.
no rebranding.
Yeah, fair enough. There's one more. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jenny Chomsky. I'm an alum of the school. I also work for the Brooklyn Navy Yard on our climate tech piloting program. My question is about innovation and speed within the agencies, the climate-related agencies, but also Department of Environmental Protection. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your approach to innovating within the agency, how you're creating a culture of innovation, even putting the mechanisms in place. You talked a little bit about procurement reform as maybe one of those, but if you could talk a little bit more about how to improve innovation such that we can sort of keep it at the pace we need to in order to solve or get to the climate solutions that the mayor's proposed.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. It is a culture change. I often think it is less about innovation and it is more about metabolism, right? The concept I tell people is that this agency needs to go to the gym, right? Because we've got a lot of work to do and we've got to get ready to do more than we are accustomed to. We've got to do more, we've got to do it faster. Some of that is about embracing new ways of doing things, and so innovation so some of it is about innovation. But it is not usually about the kind of, well, let's get in a room and a whiteboard and brainstorm level of innovation. It is about change management, right? And some of it is just about management. And we've cut our procurement time by 30% in 1 year simply by getting a lot of data and managing all of the steps and identifying where there were things that were taking place sequentially that could actually take place in parallel, and things that nobody could understand why it took us 8 days to do this step that actually takes 10 minutes and we knew it was coming 3 months earlier. And so that's a lot of it is just really tighter business processes. I mean, as we all know, like one of the problems with government is there is not a built-in incentive to keep the pressure on to deliver, right? And that is what the private sector has as an advantage that government often doesn't. That pressure comes either externally or it's about mission dedication. And that I think we have a lot of, and if we can demonstrate, if I can demonstrate to the people who work at DEP that we can do more, people respond, because most of the people at my agency are there because they actually care about the mission. That is a part of what they are there for. But some of it is also just creating the space where people think that they can try things and take on new responsibilities without signing up for nothing but downside. And the downside risk that is inherent in government innovation is actually one of our biggest problems. There's a whole field around the creation of psychological safety. And if you think about the tabloid press and social media, talk about the opposite of creating an environment of psychological safety for people to do innovation in a world in which, if it works, they're not going to cash out, right? There's no upside, right? There's only downside. And so some of it is just about, how do I create that sense that we're going to try stuff? How do I make it clear that I'm going to back them up? How does the mayor make it clear that he's going to be there for them? One of the things I think Mayor Adams has been great about is being very clear with city agencies that he expects ambition, but he doesn't expect perfection. And I've felt that. We have done things, I think, for all the right reasons, and sometimes they don't work, and he's been there to back us up and say, well, yeah, you learned, but not that you did something wrong. Mayor Bloomberg always had the line where he said, show me somebody who hasn't failed and I'll show you a failure. And that really is the spirit we have to embrace.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fascinating. Thanks for coming back, and hope to have you
Always
back on
happy to be
campus.
back at Columbia. So excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.